For the most part, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is a much better game than its predecessor. The world is more interesting, with the sky and depths added to the game. The enemies and bosses are more varied, with things like constructs, skibdos and gleeoks adding some interesting new foes to take down. And things like abilities and dungeons are better too. As a result, it's clear that Tears of the Kingdom is basically the ultimate evolution of the Breath of the Wild formula. The game the original title really should have been. Yet despite this, there are some places where the improvement doesn't hold, where Breath of the Wild has an advantage whether through missing features or poor implementation. So in this video we're going to list some of those and the ways in which Tears of the Kingdom is lacking as a result. Starting with a very minor one, the ancient horse armour. In Breath of the Wild, this DLC item made horses more usable, with the item letting you teleport them to your side at will by whistling. It was a huge quality of life upgrade and one which made them at least somewhat comparable to the warp system and Master Cycle Zero. Alas, it's missing in Tears of the Kingdom. As a result, horses go back to being as useless as before, or perhaps even more so. You can't bring them to the sky or depths, plus the Zonai devices and auto build make them more useless than ever, since a flying hover bike is a million times more convenient than an animal you have to retrieve from a stable. What's more, its absence makes no sense either. Every other DLC item from the first game makes it into the base game of Tears of the Kingdom, like the travel medallion, hero's path and armour. Either way, on to the next item now, namely the Lac of Guardians. Unlike with the horse armour, their absence does make sense in story. They were built to fight Calamity Ganon, got corrupted into an army by said villain and were a liability to the kingdom. So the past likely got scrapped and recycled here. Yet while the story presence isn't missed much, their effects on gameplay are. Why? Because here's the thing, Guardians filled an important role in Breath of the Wild's enemy roster. That being the menacing mini-boss level threat that was common enough to keep you out of in-game areas earlier in the game. Look at Hyru Castle for example. Unless you're brave as hell, you avoided those areas like the plague early on, since the Guardians were just too scary to deal with. Tears of the Kingdom doesn't have that. Oh sure, it's got lots of big bad bosses to take on, like Gleeoks, Flux Constructs and Froxes, and the basic day-to-day enemies are better now, since the extra types of Constructs, Skibdos and Horriblins mean a Bokoblin or Moblin camp isn't the only thing you encounter anymore, but there isn't really anything that fits between the two. Gloom spawn are close, but you don't see them till the last minute, and are rare enough to function more like bosses. Same deal with Lionels, like in the previous game. So the only things you got there are boss Bokoblins and high level constructs, which are about as easy to beat as the weaker minions. They're not bad variety wise, they just don't do a good job of keeping players away from the later areas, or providing a difficult challenge to overcome in said areas like the Guardians did. And speaking of endgame areas, that brings us to Hyru Castle. Arguably the best dungeon in the original Breath of the Wild, this place was a great risk versus reward setup, with some of the best weapons to find if you could brave a terrifying gauntlet of difficult enemies and errant laser beams. Its Tears of the Kingdom counterpart is a lot less exciting. Now, it's an empty husk with no enemies to encounter, and the few you do find there are usually a cakewalk, with the exception of the odd foe encountered during the story quests there. What's more, the disconnected layout doesn't help much either. Now, you've got the surface, sky and depths versions to deal with, and they're all completely separate from one another. There's no risk of finding the final boss early, there are no real interesting secrets to find in any of them, with even the stuff at Gloom's origin being more like a random cave than a climactic finale. So yeah, Hyru Castle has definitely seen a downgrade here, and one that placed alongside the Water Temple as one of the worst dungeons in the game. And sadly, the shrine quests in Tears of the Kingdom haven't fared much better. Indeed, from a quick check of the wiki, literally 2/3 of them involve taking a crystal from one place to another, with many of the exceptions being the same thing except for a trivial task in front. So, same concept, just an extra step or two added to the process. Compare this to Breath of the Wild. In that game, a large percentage of the quests didn't involve orbs or crystals at all, and instead revolved around doing side quests or NPCs. Like say, recital at Warbler's Nest, where helping the Rito children practice their song, summon a shrine, or pedestals that had to be activated with certain weapons, or by riding certain animals. And while there were a few that did involve orbs and pedestals, they always had an interesting twist to make them more fun. Like Eventide Island, where you had to retrieve the orbs using the equipment found on the island alone. Or the Stolen Heirloom quest, where completing Kakariko's side quests and stealthily following an NPC to a Yiga encounter gave you both a thrilling story adventure and interesting details about the NPC's past. Tears of the Kingdom doesn't have this, and its world building suffers immensely as a result. Continuing the world building theme, there are also a few other questionable choices when it comes to shrine and tower locations too. Namely, a few of them seem to be moved for the sake of it, such as the ones by Rito Village and Zora's Domain. In Breath of the Wild, these were easy to use. You just walked out and you were right in the middle of town where everything important was. In Tears of the Kingdom, they're literally below the village and you have to either climb a ladder or ascend to get there. It feels like change for the sake of change, player convenience be damned. And the same goes for shrines in caves too. They're a neat concept and they do make it more fun to explore caves, but many of them stuck as walk points or can be found in areas you never want to revisit. Ah well, it's a mixed bag really. While there are definitely some shrines that work better in Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom has its share of useful locations too, like the shrine near Link's house in Tarrytown, the one near Karakar Bazaar, the one near the Elden Great Skeleton, the one near the Lucky Clover Gazette, and the non-DLC one near the Yi Clan hideout. So it could go either way. Yet the shrines and towers aren't the only places that are better in Breath of the Wild. No, the intro area is another great example too, since the plateau felt more interesting to play than the Great Sky Island did, with one important reason being that the former didn't feel as much like a tutorial as the latter, and there's a good reason for that. Put simply, the Great Plateau made you want to use your abilities rather than forcing you to use them. Seriously, think about it. When did you ever need to use your runes to navigate the plateau? The answer is never. The runes were never mandatory to reach the shrines or to get around the area. Once you got Magnesis, you could beat the whole rest of the plateau without ever using it again. The same goes to the other three. Yet you didn't do this because the game made you want to use your abilities out of your own free will. It placed lots of treasure chests at the bottom of ponds to encourage you to use Magnesis. Giant metal blocks and boulders near enemies could be used to take them down. Muddy bowls could be crossed with Cryonis, etc. Put simply, you weren't ever forced to master your abilities, just placed in an environment where you'd want to do so. Tears of the Kingdom's intro area doesn't do this anywhere near as well. Oh sure, you technically don't need fuse for anything, and there are plenty of objects to test it on, but the other abilities are basically mandatory to get around. Got Ultra Hand? The next few islands need you to make rafts and minecarts with it. Got Ascend? Oh look, there's a ceiling you can ascend through that's basically impossible to bypass without a lot of climbing. And Recall is full of things like gears and Temple of Time. So, while you're certainly given a few places to try out your abilities, it's mostly a tutorial through and through, where your only route is linear and your abilities use the keys for making progress. But this is only half the issue. The other half is that the plateau also felt more interesting character and atmosphere wise too, since the old man was a consistent force throughout the whole tutorial. You encounter him at the start, then see him going through his everyday life around the plateau. He cooks food, hunts animals, sits by campfires, and checks in at every step of the way. In other words, he's both a guide to mechanics and a character in his own right. The Sky Island in Tears of the Kingdom doesn't do that as well. Oh sure, Roral technically plays the same role, but he doesn't do anything. He's not part of the world, just a spirit avatar that hangs around pondering the meaning of life. He doesn't interact with anyone except Link, and his role is entirely limited to giving you abilities. Meanwhile, the actual tutorial and living in the world role is played by the constructs, and these guys basically aren't characters at all. They're video game NPCs designed to teach you basic mechanics and nothing more. In fact, most of them could be replaced by a sign like Billboard and literally nothing would change. So the old man felt like a more interesting tutorial companion and a better guide than Roar and the Constructs did. And the issues don't really stop once you leave the intro area either. No, Breath of the Wild also makes it more obvious where you need to go too. Since in that game you're given a glider and pointed towards Kakariko Village, hence not only do you have your most important tool needed to navigate the world, but you have a clear idea where your next steps are. Tears of the Kingdom doesn't really provide this. You don't get the glider, you don't get any pointers towards Lookout Landing, you're literally just chucked off the edge and left to your own devices. If you don't decide to investigate Lookout Landing, that's basically it. You could go hours before wondering why the towers don't work and why you can't glide. It's an interesting way to emphasise the open world nature of the game, but it's more than a tad confusing for anyone starting off with this title. Either way, the plateau just felt more fun to explore with more interesting characters and more of a sense of purpose once you were done with it. Still, enough talk about locations for a bit. Let's look at a few of the mechanics that Tears of the Kingdom does worse than Breath of the Wild, such as elemental arrows. In Breath of the Wild, these were easy to use. Aim, choose an arrow type, and fire. If you wanted fire, ice, shock or bomb arrows, you could just buy them in bulk easily. That's not the case in Tears of the Kingdom. No, in this game, you have to work with fuse mechanics every time you want to fire anything outside of a normal arrow. Want to shoot a fire arrow? Well, better hope you've got a fire based item and you can find it in the giant list of materials that pops up when you use the ability. Same goes with the other kinds, and you can't speed this up in any way. Presets? Nope. Just gotta hunt down the right material each and every time. What's more, it's not exactly clear how powerful the relevant material might be either. Like, what's the difference between a fire fruit and fire choo-choo jelly, or a ruby and one of the Dinraal scales? Well, pretty damn ridiculous actually. The fruit acts like a fire arrow does, while the jelly has 2 or 3 times the range and power. And the dragon scales, gemstones and flame gliok parts, yeah, those are basically nukes. If you accidentally use one in close combat, Link is probably getting incinerated. But the game doesn't make it obvious, even with the fused attack power stats in the menu. Regardless, it's a lot easier, safer and more convenient to use elemental arrows in Breath of the Wild. Yet none of these downsides pair in the slightest to Breath of the Wild's biggest advantage over Tears of the Kingdom. The one big thing just about everyone can agree the former did better. That being champion abilities. Because to put it simply, the ones in Tears of the Kingdom absolutely suck. With the main reason being that the UI in the latest game is absolutely dreadful. You see, in Breath of the Wild, they made the champion abilities something that's tied to Link's moveset. So, if you want to use Rivali's Gao, you'd crouch down. If you want to use Daruk's protection, you'd use your shield. A Bosa's Fury would require a spin attack, etc. But that's not the case in Tears of the Kingdom. No, in this game, the ability is tied to a Sage avatar that runs around and attacks enemies. Hence to use them, you have to hunt down a relevant Sage and press A when nearby. Problem is, this is way easier said than done, since the Sages are utter morons. They run around fighting things at random, get stuck on objects miles away from Link, and screw up every strategy you might have in battle. So, when the time comes where Sidon's water ability might be useful, he'll be nowhere to be seen. He'll be off on the other side of the arena, and by the time you get to him, your chance will have long gone. And, when you add this to recharge, well, you've got a list of abilities you'd probably avoid using unless absolutely necessary. Like, why even bother setting up Riju's lightning attack if it'll probably do 10 times more damage than normal arrows in the same time frame? It's utter madness, and it gets worse. Because every ability is activated with the A button, it's also far too easy to activate the one you don't want at the worst possible time. So, have fun sending your items flying off a ledge, or blowing yourself up with your Nova's ability because there's a bomb flower nearby. What's more, the game itself showed it didn't need to be like this. In fact, in certain situations, the Sage abilities do work like the champion ones in the last game. When gliding, you can use Tulin's ability at any time to go farther, and when in a vehicle, your Nova will appear on the end and let you use his ability at any time. So why don't the other ones work like this? Why aren't the abilities just tied to actions you can do at any time, like the champion ones were? It's not a mystery, and turns out could have been a great system into something of a usability car crash not seen in almost any other Nintendo game. Either way, those are some things Breath of the Wild does better than its sequel. There aren't that many of them in the grand scheme of things, and most are on the minor side, but there are some issues nonetheless, including the utter failure of the Fuse and Sage avatar systems. Still, what do you think? Are there any other things that Breath of the Wild does better than Tears of the Kingdom? How about items on our list do you disagree with or consider strengths of the latter game instead? Leave your thoughts on the matter in the comments below, on our social media or on our Discord server today.